conquistas, construir resiliência democrática com comunidades participativas. Sejam bem-vindos ao nosso espaço. Encontramos-nos agora na Fábrica do Carvalho, um dos locais onde decorrem as diferentes sessões deste 23º OIDP. Iniciamos agora a sessão de abertura do OIDP 2024, para o qual passo a chamar ao palco o Sr. Presidente do OIDP 2024 e Presidente da Câmara Municipal de Valongo, José Manuel Ribeiro. Carola Gunnarsson, Vice-Presidente da Secção Europeia da UCLG, United Cities and Local Governments. Emilia Saiz, Secretária-Geral da UCLG. Konstantinos, Koukas, porta-voz temático da CEDL para o Congresso dos Poderes Locais e Regionais. David Pontes, diretor do Jornal Público. Mudde, Stanley Shelton, UGAF, Universidade da Geórgia.
When did you have to start? Has it been for many days or?
Para iniciarmos então a sessão de abertura, dou o uso da palavra ao Sr. Presidente José Manuel Ribeiro.
Não sei se me estão a ouvir. É assim, não é? Bom, eu, antes de mais, boa tarde a todos, vou falar em português. Eu vou falar sentado porque eu estou com uma lesão e, portanto, estou aqui a fazer um enorme esforço, mas tinha que estar hoje aqui porque é um dia muito importante, é um dia importante para o municipalismo global, é um dia importante para a democracia participativa e também é um dia importante para o município de Valongo, e para mim em particular. Hoje faz exatamente 11 anos que tomei posse como Presidente de Câmara. Foi em 17 de outubro de 2013, portanto, faz hoje 11 anos que sou autarca nesta cidade, neste concelho tão engraçado, tão extraordinário. Eu preparei um conjunto de mensagens que queria ler, como é óbvio, e, portanto, gostava de pedir a vossa atenção. Excelentíssima Vice-Presidente da Secção Europeia da United Cities and Local Governments, Carola Gunnarsson, muito obrigado por estar cá. Excelentíssima Secretária-Geral da United Cities and Local Governments, Emilia Saiz, minha amiga, muito obrigado do coração por estares cá. Excelentíssimo Representante do Congresso das Autoridades Locais e Regionais do Conselho da Europa, Konstantinos, Koukas, muito obrigado. Excelentíssimo Keynote Speaker, Professor Mudde, muito obrigado por estar em Portugal, em Valongo, Grande Porto. E excelentíssimo Diretor do Jornal Público, David Pontes, muito obrigado também pela presença, é sempre um gosto. Meus caros mayors, alcaides, presidentes de Câmara Municipais, vereadores, presidentes de juntas, governadores, meus caros representantes de organizações da sociedade civil com intervenções em cidades e regiões de todo o mundo. Meus caros membros de centros de investigação, académicos e estudiosos da política e da democracia. Meus queridos ativistas da liberdade, defensores dos direitos dos cidadãos. Meus caros ativistas da democracia, da proximidade, da transparência e da participação dos cidadãos em tantos países do mundo. Estimados convidados, minhas senhoras e meus senhores, permitam-me um cumprimento especial, muito especial, ao nosso Presidente da Assembleia Municipal, que é a Assembleia Municipal, é a Assembleia onde está representada toda a população, que está cá hoje também, quero uma palavra muito especial para ele, e para a minha equipa, que tenho uma estima muito grande, a senhora Vice-Presidente, os senhores vereadores, a equipa que organizou este evento, que é uma equipa muito pequenina, mas que trabalha com muita paixão. Às vezes perguntam-me como é que nós fazemos tanta coisa? E eu digo, e é verdade, nós podemos fazer tudo se tivermos paixão, se tivermos valores, se soubermos o que queremos, mas se tivermos paixão. E aqui em Valongo nós tentamos fazer o máximo e, portanto, sem eles e sem a paixão que nós tentamos sempre passar para estas equipas não era possível e, portanto, foi possível, e eu acho que neste momento o que eu tenho que fazer é agradecer, porque a palavra obrigado é uma palavra muito importante. O tema que Valongo se propôs discutir nesta 23ª Conferência do Observatório Internacional da Democracia Participativa, as ameaças populistas, construir a resiliência democrática com comunidades participativas, foi concebido como resposta a dar ao sentimento difuso de mal-estar que um pouco por todo o mundo atravessa as sociedades democráticas quanto aos níveis de envolvimento cívico das comunidades e à própria legitimidade dos seus sistemas políticos. Esse sentimento de crise está presente um pouco por todo o lado. E basta a campanha eleitoral para eleger o próximo presidente dos Estados Unidos da América, a que estamos a assistir em direto, para nos lembrar dele. Não quero, no entanto, começar a minha intervenção pelas sensações nas democracias. Quero começar por dar a todos as boas-vindas a Valongo, à área metropolitana do Porto e a Portugal. É para nós um orgulho e uma grande honra receber-vos num município, numa região e num país que estão a celebrar 50 anos de liberdade, 50 anos de democracia, 50 anos de Estado de Direito e de Estado Social. Portugal está, em 2024, em plena celebração da sua democracia. E também por isso, Valongo empenhou-se totalmente em fazer desta conferência uma grande festa da democracia. Os valores democráticos, a sua promoção e a sua proteção vão ser o centro de todos os debates que vão ocorrer ao longo de 3 dias de intensa discussão nesta conferência. É para mim um motivo de orgulho, de particular orgulho, dar início a esta conferência hoje, como já referi, dia 17 de outubro, no exato dia em que cumpro 11 anos de mandato enquanto Presidente da Câmara Municipal de Valongo. São 11 anos, ou seja, 132 meses e muitos dias, com todas as suas noites, todos os seus dias, ao serviço de todas as pessoas desta extraordinária comunidade. E os meus colegas autarcas sabem bem a que é que eu me refiro. Cumprimos todos estes dias, cada um deles, com a paixão pela vida que me alimenta todos os dias e com a consciência precisa de que o poder que exerço não me pertence. É um poder delegado pelos votos. É um poder temporário. É um poder tão forte quanto transitório. Um poder que deve ser exercido com muita firmeza, é certo, e ao mesmo tempo com toda a humildade. E é importante lembrar que, quando nós falamos de democracia, falamos de poder, falamos da natureza humana, ou melhor, devíamos falar mais vezes de natureza humana. É muito difícil perceber a relação entre a natureza humana e esta construção extraordinária que é a democracia. Porque a natureza humana é propensa à falha, a natureza humana é propensa ao poder. A natureza humana fica deslumbrada com o poder. Não só os políticos, qualquer pessoa fica deslumbrada com o poder. E aí muitas vezes estão os problemas do nosso sistema. É muito difícil criar um sistema democrático perfeito, porque tem a ver com a nossa natureza humana imperfeita. Mas pelo menos temos consciência disso e podemos trabalhar, construir remédios no sentido de encontrar os melhores sistemas, as melhores práticas para corrigir essa nossa falha. Ou seja, nós acabamos por ter um bug. Já vimos com um bug. É assim, é o bug humano, não somos perfeitos. Também se fôssemos perfeitos éramos anjos e não estaríamos aqui com tantos problemas, não teríamos guerras. Estamos de passagem nos cargos e é nosso dever ético aspirar a que quem nos suceder faça sempre melhor do que nós. A democracia é uma forma de organização política de tal forma potente que a história da humanidade não conhece até hoje nenhuma sociedade em que outro sistema político tenha produzido melhores resultados. Não falo apenas de resultados morais, éticos, mentais ou simbólicos, como o humanismo, o Estado de Direito, a liberdade religiosa, a ciência ou a cultura. Falo também de resultados profundamente materiais, como o nível de inovação e de competitividade das economias, a prosperidade social, a qualidade das infraestruturas, a segurança na doença, no desemprego ou na velhice. A democracia também é, porém, uma flor frágil e delicada, sujeita a ataques, como nos estão a lembrar os populismos autoritários que florescem no interior das próprias democracias ocidentais, fragilizando-as momentaneamente. Simultaneamente poderosa e frágil, a democracia tem de ser cultivada e defendida cotidianamente, todos os dias, a todas as horas e instantes. Ora, uma das melhores formas de a cultivarmos e de a defendermos é promover dentro da democracia os mecanismos da participação das cidadãs e dos cidadãos. A democracia representativa e a democracia participativa são como duas irmãs gêmeas, crescem uma com a outra, aprendem uma com a outra, porém, também sofrem uma com a outra. Se uma é atacada, a outra fica igualmente fragilizada. E isto traz-nos para o centro desta 23ª Conferência da OIDP e para o tema geral dos nossos debates. Os mecanismos da democracia participativa são, em si próprios, condições de possibilidade das democracias num período em que estas estão em todo o mundo sob ameaças e ataques populistas. As democracias representativas serão tanto mais saudáveis quanto incluírem, desenvolverem e alargarem os mecanismos de participação e de intervenção dos cidadãos. Os mecanismos de democracia participativa melhoram as escolhas políticas, ao mesmo tempo que valorizam e qualificam todos os elementos da comunidade. Este exercício de soberania por parte do povo não põe em causa a legitimidade democrática que os políticos eleitos receberam através do voto. Pelo contrário, reforça. E reforçam também a qualidade das políticas públicas. Isto não acontece por acaso. Sucede porque os cidadãos trazem para a discussão e para a decisão política a ciência, o conhecimento baseado em evidências, os métodos académicos, o estudo e a reflexão que são verificados, auditados e escrutinados por outros cidadãos. Esta participação cidadã baseia a sua intervenção no conhecimento e na ciência, na verdade, e não na desinformação ou nas fake news. Esta participação dos cidadãos deve ser a base sobre a qual devem nascer as políticas públicas do futuro. Quanto mais os cidadãos tiverem acesso ao conhecimento, quanto mais liberdade e recursos as universidades e os centros de investigação dispuserem, mais e melhores condições terão as mulheres e os homens de cada comunidade para tomarem as suas escolhas e para as apresentarem aos políticos eleitos. A liberdade, a democracia e o desenvolvimento social só são possíveis, só são viáveis quando estão baseados no conhecimento e na ciência. quando se fundam nos factos objetivos e nas evidências, na inovação. É com estas armas, a verdade, a ciência, o conhecimento, que a nova geração de políticas públicas deve enfrentar os populismos excludentes que ameaçam a saúde dos sistemas democráticos. Perante problemas complexos, os populismos autoritários impulsionam as emoções e a demagogia. Dissolvem as diferenças entre o que é verdade e o que é mentira. Introduzem doses maciças de agressividade na disputa política. Radicalizam posições e quase sempre tratam os adversários como inimigos. Perante esta realidade preocupante em todo o mundo, devemos refletir aqui em Valongo sobre o potencial, o enorme potencial dos mecanismos de participação democrática para combater a desinformação, seja ela online, pelas redes sociais, seja através dos média tradicionais como a televisão. E é precisamente por terem o material genético original das democracias que os processos participativos contêm em si próprios as virtudes dos sistemas democráticos e das suas regras e processos. Estes processos participativos constituem-se hoje como escolas de práticas democráticas e verdadeiras incubadoras de resiliência às fake news e à utilização malévola da inteligência artificial para manipular as populações. É nos mecanismos de participação democrática que reside o futuro dos regimes democráticos, do Estado de Direito e do Estado Social. Uma nova geração de políticas locais deverá ter, por isso, no seu centro o novo movimento municipalista e a centralidade que as mulheres e o movimento feminista municipalista representam para o futuro global. É necessário comprometer os cidadãos com novas políticas sustentáveis, que implicam reduções relevantes nos consumos, por forma a proteger os ecossistemas e a promover genuinamente a equidade social e oportunidades para todos. Instituições e cidadãos têm de construir um futuro mais fundado na partilha e na solidariedade, onde o crescimento incessante das economias seja gradualmente substituído pela procura de um novo equilíbrio e de uma nova vida com mais qualidade para todos. São muitos temas para discutir, com total liberdade intelectual e política ao longo dos próximos 3 dias. Em Valongo, terra de liberdade e de democracia, esta grande conferência internacional integra o início de um ano inteiro de comemorações de 50 anos de democracia local, a democracia de proximidade. E sobre a democracia de proximidade, devo dizer, a nível local, ao nível da proximidade, onde se governa olhos nos olhos, é muito difícil vingar as fake news. Se fizerem essa análise nos municípios, nas cidades onde as pessoas se conhecem, é muito difícil passarem as fake news, porque as pessoas conhecem-se e sabem que as fake news não são verdadeiras, porque de manhã estiveram com aquela pessoa, à tarde encontraram aquela pessoa, à noite encontraram aquela pessoa. E, portanto, é na democracia de proximidade que reside uma base muito forte para ajudar a dar força à democracia no seu todo. É para nós muito significativo que o Observatório Internacional da Democracia Participativa e todas as cidades, regiões e organizações que o compõem tenham comparecido a esta conferência, que em vez de se realizar numa grande cidade mundial, se realiza esta edição de 2024 numa grande cidade média mundial portuguesa chamada Valongo. As cidades e os municípios médios como Valongo são fundamentais em processos como o combate às alterações climáticas, ao acolhimento de populações que se deslocam dos espaços rurais, à promoção da inclusão e da justiça social, à oferta da educação e da cultura, à promoção da igualdade de oportunidades e ao bom funcionamento do elevador social. Sobre este e outros temas, todos nós, portugueses e valonguenses, temos muito a aprender com os participantes nesta conferência e com todas as discussões que vão ter lugar nos próximos 3 dias. Disponham de nós para terem à vossa disposição todos os recursos necessários a uma boa discussão e a uma frutuosa troca de argumentos. Sejam bem-vindos todos. Tenham todos uma boa conferência. Muito obrigado.
Muito obrigada, Sr. Presidente José Manuel Ribeiro. Dou então o uso da palavra a Carola Gunnarsson.
Thank you very much for inviting me, giving me this opportunity to visit Valongo. Dear Mr. President of IOPD, dear Mayor, dear colleague, and as you said when you opened your speech, dear activists of democracy, I'm really happy to see you all. 2024 is the year of elections. In more than 70 countries, the citizens are going to the ballot boxes this year. But elections are unfortunately not the same thing as democracy, even if we all would like it to be so. The level of democracy enjoyed by the average person in the world is back to 1985. The world continues to become more autocratic. The world is now almost evenly divided between 91 democracies and 88 autocracies. But 71% of the world population lives in autocracies. That's 5.7 billion people. Think of that. 5.7 billion people are living in autocracies. That's an increase from 48% 10 years ago. Almost all the components of democracy are getting worse in more countries than they are getting better compared to 10 years ago. Freedom of expression remains the worst affected component of democracy and is worsening in 35 countries in 2023. Clean elections is now the second, deteriorating in 23 countries and improving in 12 countries. Freedom of association, including civil society, is the third most deteriorating component. 20 countries are restricting these rights, while only 3 countries are expanding it. We can see serious attacks towards human rights and see that gender equality goes backwards. Violence against women remains one of the most serious obstacles to the realization of women's political, social, and economic rights today. One aspect of this is the scale of prevailing discriminatory legislation and policies. All over the world, we can see that politicians, both women and men, are threatened, subjected to violence, and even killed. Hate speech, fake news, verbal and physical abuse are becoming part of the everyday experiences of politicians. The fact that elected officials are subjected to threats, hatred, and violence because of their political mission risks eroding the democratic system even more. This very dark and brutal picture of the situation in the world underlines even more the importance of the work we are doing on the local level in our municipalities, cities, and regions. We as local political leaders have an advantage. We are nearest to the citizens and we know their needs. We can together build a society based on democracy and trust. There are many challenges, but we have the opportunities and many of the solutions in our hands. One important part of this, or let me say crucial thing, is the involvement of the citizens and the civil society. That's the only way of creating a sustainable society. The theme of this conference is of the highest relevance in a time of challenges for democracy. I believe that without participatory democracy, we will not be able to build the democratic resilience we all need. We need to engage the citizens, and they with us, the local leaders. Democracy is built by people, for people. I'm really looking forward to the discussions during the upcoming days, because I think that together we can take important steps forward and make a change. Thank you very much.
Muito obrigada, Carola. Vai então usar da palavra Emilia Saiz.
Muchas gracias. Thank you very much. I was thinking, what do you say after that? After everything that has been said, after these not only inspiring speeches, but I would say these cries for democracy, this call to rise above ourselves, to surmount the problems that human nature provides us, to surmount the problems that the context is giving us. This is what the mayor and our vice president have done, is calling us to rise above that whole. And the reason why they do that is because if you are a local leader, like many of you here in this room, if you work at local and territorial level, there is simply no other option. I agree with you, Mayor, very, very much, that democracy is not only important for the soul and for the social benefits that you get and for the parity that we should be getting, but it's also efficient, and we have proven that. It is efficient, democracy. If you do it well, it gives really good results. I very much agree with that. But there is also a part of the job that we need to do that consists in knowing why we have gotten to this, maybe. And in this era of transformation, it is important for a constituency like ours, the one that I represent as Secretary General of United Cities and Local Governments, the people that I work for, you. It is our role to also analyze, how did we get here? What is making people lose faith? Faith in that system that has proven to be so efficient and important. And the answer can be that for a very long time, we have accepted models that have fostered inequalities. We have accepted that as part of the model. We have accepted models that did not take into account the dignity of people, but that saw people as producing machines. We have accepted a model that did not relate well with nature, and that is also something that we have to change. And the answers from those models are given by the mayor just now. He's calling for a feminist approach. And this is not only about having more women sitting in the front row, it's about much more than that. It's about a different approach to leadership and a different type of service provision. It's a call to proximity, that what keeps us together, what glues us together. And it's also a call for renaturing and establishing a new relationship with nature that we don't see only as a resource, but as part of our humanity. So that's what our movement stands for. And that is what this conference needs to allow us to think about. How do you do that? And how do you conquer those minds and souls again that are now changing the way they participate? Because if we're going to talk about participation, it's not only about little participation or not enough means, but the very means of participation have been transformed. And social media has created a type of participation in the heads and minds of a lot of people that do not allow for coming to conclusions. It's just an expression of a wish or of a way of looking at things, but it doesn't create an atmosphere where you actually need to sit, tend bridges, and negotiate your way out. And so that kind of different type of participation is not only about fake news and things that might not be true and that are portrayed as true, but it's also about the notion of wrong expectations when you express a wish and that wish being transformed suddenly into a decision, which is not something that can happen just like that. And that is part of a democratic didactic that I think can only happen at local level. We live in a world that has lost its own soul of humanity, I would dare say, right now, in a world where we are not using the same judgment and measures when people are inflicting some of the rules that we all need to go by. And that is something that people see around the world, and it's compromising as well, the way that they look at the very core of democracy. So what do we want to do in an organization like United Cities and Local Governments and with the International Observatory on Participation and Democracy? We want to make sure that we create this kind of safe spaces where we can have the tough talks about what it means, about the specific tools and the specific actions that we need to deploy to learn to be democratic again, to learn to participate again. And we want to create that space, and I hope that Mudde now is going to address that in his keynote speech very soon, about how that education and didactics and way of living of the wonderful places like Valongo of the world can actually shape and impact the global level as well. And how multilateralism and the way that we take decisions globally can be impacted by those communities that know each other and that can make a difference between what is true and what is not. And so in the coming days, the expectations that we have is that you will tackle the very actionable commitments, the very specific tools that we can use. The awards winners have presented some wonderful practices, and I have been lucky enough to see there are awards winners from other years walking around, very specific things that we can implement to make that transformation. And I think that is our role as networks of local and regional governments. And that is the kind of conversation that we want to foster. A conversation that shouldn't stay here and that needs to permeate to your communities back home, but also a conversation that needs to go up and inform and influence decision-making at global level. Because local and global are connected in ways that it has never been before. And it is unavoidable to look at the global level if you want to be a good mayor, if you want to have a sound community. So that's why we are here. And it's also an emotional moment, and I will start finishing already. An emotional moment to be in Valongo because we have been brainstorming about these things together for a very long time. Not 11 years, but many years now, Mayor. So it is very emotional and a pity that I have to see you in your home with pain. it's unfair, you know, universe is saying something, and maybe it needs to inspire us to surmount many of the challenges that we have. But I can already share with you one feeling, and it's about your team and what they have done here. When you enter in this space, you already know that you are in a different process than you would be anywhere else. Believe me, I live in this kind of podia, and this one is different. I go from one to the other, right? This one is different. You can sense it in this space. You can sense it in the music that welcomes us. This is a safe port that will allow us to have the tough, but also the gentle conversation. I want to thank you, Mayor, for the inspiration you have provided to the movement. I want to thank your team, for sure. I also want to thank the team of the International Observatory, our dear head of the observatory, Adrià Duarte, and my own team in United Cities and local governments, because I know how tough it is to keep this community alive. And this is the type of community that needs to feed into the movement. So thank you again for giving us this space, and thank you to all of those cities that are leaving the mark in the work that we do together. Thank you to Barcelona for putting additional efforts so that the International Observatory can exist. Thank you to Grenoble, to Rio, to Montreal, that have given a space to many of the discussions that we have had. Really, to our colleagues from Côte d'Ivoire, it is a pleasure to have worked with you and to see how your thoughts are feeding into our work. Be bold during the coming days. Don't give up, and think that we will only change things if we do it through proximity, through renaturing, and through a different type of leadership that I would dare say, Mayor, it needs to be feminist. Yes, why not? Thank you very much.
Muito obrigada, Emilia. Dou o uso da palavra a Konstantinos Koukas.
Hello. First of all, I would like to express my gratitude to the mayor that is not here now for the invitation to be here today with all of you. Dear guests of this conference, dear people of Valongo, dear colleagues from the municipal and the regional authorities. It is a unique experience also for me. I will continue your speech. It's the first time I come to this place, to this city, and I felt the same mood, as you said, at this conference. It has something unique. And this is the spirit of the team of Valongo municipality. Me, myself, also as a municipal councillor and former mayor of the Greek island of Mykonos, and as a spokesperson for the European Local Democracy Week of the Congress of Local and Regional Authorities of the Council of Europe and Vice President of it, I feel very nice to be here with you for this conference and share our concerns about the issue of this conference. We heard already a lot, but I will continue the thoughts. Why is participatory democracy so crucially important in current times? I believe that we can all agree, and we will understand it in the following days, that the rise of populist movements faced by our societies poses a real threat to the very foundation of democracy. These movements thrive on the growing belief that traditional democratic mechanisms such as elections, you said we have 70 this year, political parties and representative institutions as the Council of Europe, the Congress of Local Authorities, or the municipalities, are failing to address citizens' needs. Worse, they claim the whole system is raised against ordinary citizens, corrupted from the inside out. Populism also creates divisions within society by pushing exclusionary narratives that blame and exclude minorities. It erodes our sense of belonging by turning people against one another. By trampling on key democratic values and the principle of inclusivity, populist leaders fuel a dangerous level of distrust in our institutions and communities. Once that distrust takes root, populist leaders step forward, claiming to be the only champions of the common citizens and offering easy answers to complex issues. It is a dangerous path. We must stay vigilant, but more importantly, we must take action. So, how can we strengthen our democracies to stand up to the dangers of populism? There are many answers to this question, but one is essential. It lies in building participatory communities where citizens are not just spectators, but active participants in the democratic processes. Participatory democracy goes beyond just casting a vote. It creates a continuous and interactive dynamic where citizens have a direct voice in the decisions that affect their lives. It does not just encourage participation, but institutionalize it. I cannot say that word. Institutionalize it. It's good. If participation is a permanent part of governance, we can ensure that citizens' voices are heard and their input is valued. Thus, participatory democracy is a powerful antidote to populism. It gives citizens a sense of ownership in the political process, addressing the frustrations that populist leaders exploit. When people are actively involved in shaping public policies, they are less likely to feel disconnected or disenfranchised and more likely to trust democratic institutions. Participatory communities also foster pluralism by creating spaces for dialogue between different groups and ensuring diverse voices are included in the policy-making process. This is where the link between participatory democracy and democratic resilience becomes clear. By institutionalizing mechanisms of participation, we do not only empower citizens, but also build a more robust, pluralistic democracy that is better equipped to withstand the threats posed by disinformation, fake news, distrust, and populist trends. When we discuss participatory democracy, we are talking about many practical ways to get citizens more actively involved in decision-making. This can include initiatives such as participatory budgeting, where community members help determine how public funds are allocated. Citizens' assemblies, which give people a space to express their concerns, deliberate on solutions, and make recommendations. Digital e-democracy platforms that make participation accessible to everyone through their electronic devices. Collaborative workshops, where residents work alongside policymakers to co-create solutions for specific challenges. Youth councils, which amplify young voices in the governance process. Only to mention some of them. One initiative that I'm especially familiar with, and one that encompasses all these practical implementations of participatory democracy, is the European Local Democracy Week. Organized by the Congress of Local and Regional Authorities, the European Local Democracy Week plays a vital role in promoting events organized by cities and regions with their citizens. It encourages local authorities, such as a municipality, to implement participatory mechanisms which give citizens the chance to engage with their local governments. Events and activities can take place through the year, with a flagship event during the week of October 15. Every year, the Congress awards the title of Partner of the European Local Democracy Week to recognize local authorities and associations which have organized the most effective activities to sustain local democracy and citizen participation through the year. The city of Valongo has been for many years, and you must be proud, the citizens of it, and it has been for many years, the city of Valongo, an active and initiative partner of the European Week. Its engagement has been acknowledged through the awarding of several titles as a partner of the European Local Democracy Week. Every year, the municipality organizes a wide range of activities. Beyond that, in 2024, as we know, Valongo has set up children's councils, offered learning opportunities on local citizenship through courses and exhibitions, organized a community clean-up along the river, and held public sessions to present the municipal youth plan. These are just a few examples of the impactful actions that have been implemented here in this very specific municipality. I would like to express my gratitude again to Valongo and to its mayor for their active involvement in the European Week of Local Democracy Week. This conference that we are here and we start now offers a great opportunity for anyone to learn more about others' experiences and best practices. And this is exactly the purpose of the European Local Democracy Week, to serve as a platform for sharing best practices, to learn from each other's successes and challenges, even failures, to help taking creative initiatives, as well as to give visibility to cities and region initiatives aimed at promoting the participation of their citizens. Coming back to the central theme of this conference, how can the participatory democracy help us counter populist threats and build democratic resilience? Let me highlight that populism thrives on division, exclusion, and a growing distrust in our democratic institutions, when participatory democracy, by contrast, offers a path toward inclusive governance. By building participatory democracy communities at the local level, we can create a more resilient democracy. After all, it is at the local level where citizens, as it said before, feel the most direct effects of political decisions. Fostering a culture of participation lays a strong foundation for democratic resilience that can extend to national and international level. Together, we can build a democracy that we can withstand the challenges of populism and upholding pluralism and inclusion. We can demonstrate that democracy, and I speak as a Greek, where it is a motherland of democracy, is not just a system of government, but a set of values that must be actively defended and promoted. I encourage each one of you, to take the lessons learned from this very conference back to your communities and continue the essential work of building democratic resilience through participation. Let's ensure that democracy remains a system of government that prioritizes the interests of citizens, safeguards their rights, and creates a future where every voice is heard. Thank you very much.
Muito obrigada. Vou então dar o uso da palavra a caso Mudde, Stanley Shelton UGAF, com uma pequena apresentação.
There we are. Thank you very much. Oh, there we are. Thank you very much to the mayor, but also particularly for the team, which has communicated so well with me over the last weeks, months, I must say, actually organizing this. We have talked quite a lot about, or at least the previous speakers have talked quite a lot about the democratic resilience as well as the participatory communities. I'm going to focus a little bit more on the populist threats to explain the key threat today as well as how significant it is, and then speak at a more abstract level about what we can do. To me, however, it is very important that we understand what we are facing. So the idea is that democracy is in crisis. It's an omnipresent narrative, both in academic and public debates. Has even led to some international bestsellers, like How Democracies Die, which is actually an excellent book, strongly recommended. Book like On Tyranny, which thinks that the best way to survive today is by learning languages. From the 1930s, which I think is well overstated. But whether or not democracy dies or is eroding, what is the common term, depends a little bit on your perspective, both on your terminology and the time period. So if you look at electoral democracies, which are democracies in the most narrow sense, where popular sovereignty and majority rule are combined. So here democracy is by and large that people elect their leaders by majority. We had 16 in the 1920s across the globe, 30 in 1960, 85 in 2000, and 91 in 2023. So at the basic level, democracy is still growing. But if we focus more specifically on liberal democracies, which combine popular sovereignty and majority rule, but extend that with rule of law, with minority rights, with separations of powers, and of course with the independence of media and judiciary, we see a little bit different development. We see a growth from 1927, 1960, 17, 2039, to a fallback in 2023 to 2032, right? And so there are two things to take away from this. First of all, democracy as such, both as an idea and as a regime, is actually still growing. However, liberal democracy, which combines majority rule and minority rights, and which is the type of system that we generally understand democracy, the term, to mean, is much less common and is indeed in trouble in the 21st century. And I think this is important because much of the discussion that we often have had, particularly in the late 20th century, was about countries not becoming democratic. What we saw already in the 1990s was electoral democracies, minimal democracies, not becoming liberal democracies. Think about particularly post-communist Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, countries like Russia, Ukraine, which had a lot of potential, which became democracies, which were moving and then halted. And in certain cases, particularly Russia, kind of fell back. What is perhaps unique to the 21st century is that we're now talking about democracy in crisis in countries that we believed were safe. Like countries that were liberal democratic with their own struggles, but still at very high levels, which are now being challenged by populism or the far right. I give you two. One, the one I come from, originally, the Netherlands. A long established liberal democracy, in many ways very progressive, particularly on LGBTQI issues, and yet currently has a far-right government. And the country I live in, which is the United States, which will have elections in less than 3 weeks, which do not look well, and which was a model for centuries, by and large, as the democratic ideal, and with all its flaws, right, is now actually facing truly an election that could end US democracy. Now, we all know what the main threat is because the media tells us always. It's populism. But the media doesn't tell us very well what populism is. So my own definition is that populism is an ideology that considers society to ultimately separate it into two homogeneous and antagonistic groups, the pure people versus the corrupt elite, and which argues that politics should be an expression of the volonté générale, or general will of the people. Sounds like a lot. I will bring it back to the essence. Populism is a thin ideology, which means that populism itself tells us mostly its view on society. It tells us mostly that there's only one legitimate group in society, which are the people. They are homogeneous. There's no other group except one, the elite. But they're corrupt, and therefore they're not legitimate. It doesn't tell us much about which political system is the best, except that it should be a voice of the people. And so populism is compatible with basic democracy, electoral democracy. But it doesn't say much about which economic system. And so most populist actors today combine their populism with another ideology, which generally is on the left, some form of socialism. Think about Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, or Syriza in Greece, or some form of nativism on the right. Think about Trump, or think about Marine Le Pen. Now, the core of populism are monism and moralism, and both are problematic for liberal democracy. Monism, strictly speaking, is the opposite of pluralism, and pluralism is the foundation of liberal democracy. Pluralism means that you believe that society consists out of various groups which have different interests and different values, and these are all legitimate. Monism thinks that there's only one group. Now, monism in itself already has problems with compromises, because there's only one group. Why should you compromise? But the fact that the main distinction between the people and the elite is based on morality, namely the people are pure of heart, the elite are corrupt, means that compromise leads to the corruption of the pure people. And so populism is fundamentally against compromising, which is the essence of a liberal democratic system. Now, there are various reasons why populism is where it is today. At a very abstract level, I have referenced populism as an illiberal democratic response to undemocratic liberalism, which is not just a play of words, there's actually a meaning to it. First of all, as I argued, populism in itself is democratic in the sense that it believes in popular sovereignty and majority rule, or at least claims to. It is illiberal democratic because it doesn't believe in minority rights. It doesn't believe in separation of powers. It doesn't believe in rule of law. It responds to both a situation and a feeling that we're currently in a period of undemocratic liberalism. And when we think about liberalism, we think first of all about economics, neoliberalism, but also a more cultural level of liberalism. The idea that there are certain rights and there's politics is outside of the democratic arena. Let me give two examples. First of all, in neoliberalism, many core services have been privatized. As a consequence, they're outside of the purview of the state, but that also means they're outside of the democratic arena. I give an example that lays close to my heart as a Dutch person, certainly not as an American citizen, but public transport. Within the EU, as an example, public transport has been privatized in many countries, which means that the logic, which initially was to connect everyone, has now become a market logic. And the logic is efficiency. So what happens, those lines that are not cost effective are being closed or reduced. This is, of course, predominantly rural areas where there are fewer people. But this does two things. First of all, in reality, it disconnects people from the center, from jobs, from cultural events, from medical facilities, etc. But also psychologically, it tells them you're not that important. Now, once you bring that up as a citizen and say, look, they just cut the bus line, or they reduced the number of trains, the politician will say, well, but that's a company. Right? We cannot intervene there. It's a private company. But for most citizens, they think, no, that is a state task. The state should take care of it. But it's the state that gave that away. Right? A second one is the death penalty. In many countries, the death penalty has been deleted, has been abolished. And now, when there is a debate about the death penalty, politicians will say, oh, we can't do that. Because if we do that, we can't be a part of the Council of Europe or of the European Union. Now, my argument is not for the reintroduction of the death penalty. My point is that the death penalty is a political issue. Yes, it is partly illegal, but we have decided as a community, as a society, to abolish it. Politicians should defend that, not by saying, out of our hands, this is up to the judges, but saying, for moral reasons, we are opposed to the death penalty. And so, many of these decisions, the neoliberal and the cultural liberal decisions, were taken in a very narrow way democratically, namely by democratically elected politicians. But they were often not taken after a democratic debate. Most of the time, these issues were never discussed before elections. You couldn't vote on it. You voted for a party that then decided to privatize public transport or to move certain responsibilities to Europe. But they didn't ask us whether we supported that. And so that's what I refer to as undemocratic liberalism. My point is not necessarily whether the liberalism is good or bad. My point is that these should have been taken after extensive debates among the people. Now, shifting focus, although populist threat is the term, and I have written books about populism, I actually believe that populism is not that relevant today. Populism actually is on the decline in many countries, and there are two reasons for it. First of all, so-called populist actors on both the left and the right have become more and more mainstreamed. They have become accepted by the political mainstream. And as a consequence, they became less populist. Like when you're excluded by everyone else, you will say that everyone else is corrupt. But if the right wants to govern with you, then obviously the right is no longer corrupt. It's just the left. Or vice versa, if the left wants to govern with you, only the right is corrupt. And so when you look at Giorgia Meloni, the Italian prime minister, she's not a populist. She doesn't say that all politicians are corrupt. Only the left politicians are corrupt. Similarly, Podemos, which governs with the center-left, doesn't say that PSOE is corrupt. It's the right that is corrupt. But there's also a decline of left populism. Both Syriza and Podemos are not the forces that they were just after the Great Recession, and actually their populism has gone down significantly. Even in Latin America, while left populism, if you want to call it that, is still in power in Venezuela, it has lost all of its inspiration that it had at the turn of the century. So the real threat to democracy today is actually the far right. But populism is secondary to the far right. Yes, much of the far right is anti-elite, right? Which is a vertical distinction. You're part of the same ethnic group, but they are the elite corrupt. We're the people down here, we're pure. But as said, Meloni is no longer populist. The Sweden Democrats are no longer populist. The core of the far right is nativism. It is the idea that the country is for natives only. Now, obviously, who is and isn't native is a construction. It's not an objective condition. In most cases, the native is defined ethnically, culturally, although implicitly there's almost always biology. Right? And so the Dutch person is defined in a certain culture, but implicitly is white. While nativism is absolutely central to Trump or Le Pen, it is less central to the far right in Latin America, like Bolsonaro, or José Antonio Cast in Chile, but that is in part because issues that trigger it, like immigration, are not as central. But as soon as they become more central, they will always, these politicians will always defend a nativist vision, as you see with Cast, for example, to the indigenous uprising in the south of Chile. And as we have seen in Central and Eastern Europe, where we had a lot of far-right leaders that we knew were far-right, but immigration was a non-issue, so they didn't speak about it. As soon as the so-called refugee crisis of 2015-16 started, they all defended a very nativist vision. So, coming back to democracy in crisis, what is eroding and who is eroding democracy? What is eroding strongest when the far right is in power, but also when left populists are in power, and the few times that that happened, are specific institutions, particularly the media and the judiciary. Independent media are a major concern of populists and the far right, and they don't censor often in the old ways of the Soviet Union. They do it much more in a neoliberal type way, where it's all about money. So when a newspaper is very critical of a far-right government or a populist government, they will threaten to no longer advertise in these media. Most media have a very small profit margin. If they lose state or subnational public advertisement, they lose massive resources. If that doesn't work, then these leaders will say to companies that still are advertising in these newspapers, if you continue to advertise in that newspaper, we won't give you state contracts. Easy choice for most companies, right? And if that all doesn't work, you just have one of your cronies buy the newspaper. And so all of these things are technically within the law. Now, the most ultimate form of this is not even Putin in Russia, it's actually Viktor Orban in Hungary. Orban did all of this, pulled back state subsidies, then leaned on companies, then had his friends buy newspapers, sometimes shut them down, and said, I just bought your newspaper for €2 million, but I think there's no business here, so I'm going to fold this. In the end, to just show that this was all political, all of these people who bought newspapers, radio stations, and whatever, decided all very spontaneously to give them all to a foundation. A foundation which obviously is controlled by a close friend of Viktor Orban. Right? It's very hard to do anything against this because no law is really broken, but the effect is the same. Right? Independent media is almost dead in Hungary. Independent judiciary always a problem. And let's be clear, in many cases where populist or the far right gets successful, the media was never fully independent and the judiciary was never not corrupt. And think about a country like Italy. It's not that the corruption started when Berlusconi came up, right? He didn't make it better for sure, but they were already struggling with it. And that is important, like, because we have a discourse increasingly of like, we had this perfect democracy, was going great, and then those evil populists came, those evil far right came, and they destroyed it all, right? That's not how it works. Generally, the far right and populists are strong in countries that do not function very well. The problem is they make it worse. It is rare, though, that the far right actually ends democracy as such. There's one clear case of populism ending democracy, which is Venezuela, just to show that this is not exclusively a right-wing issue. And there is an argument that Hungary is at the very least not a liberal democracy anymore, but certain scholars argue that it's not a democracy, that should the Hungarians finally elect someone else than Orban, that Orban will not allow that. And he can stop it because he controls the electoral council and all kind of other ways. What is very interesting is that you could think that there is some type of democratic, anti-democratic mood, in the sense that the people have all moved to the far right, and as a consequence, the far right does better. The people become more nativist, they become more homophobic, therefore those parties do well. But that's not what happens. As far as we have data, in Europe, for example, people have become overall either as left-wing or progressive as they were, or a little bit more. And the reason is not that people have become individually more progressive. No, older people are replaced by younger people, and younger people overall are more inclusive than older people. We know this from Europe, we know this from the United States, but for example, we also know it with regard to LGBTQI issues in Latin America, where we see a huge backlash in politics, but the population has actually become more inclusive. So this is not a movement that swells up from the bottom. This is not a mass movement. It actually comes much more from the elites. And that brings me to who is eroding democracy. Yes, it is mostly the far right. Think about Trump, think about Meloni, Orban before Law and Justice, in Poland, Bolsonaro, and Brazil. What is crucial, though, the far right never wins the majority of the votes. In certain cases, it wins the majority of the seats because the electoral system is very disproportionate. For example, Orban came to power with around 40% of the votes, which gave him more than 2/3 of the seats. Trump won the US election with more than 2.5 million less votes than Clinton, might win again in 3 weeks, but will certainly lose the popular vote, but might win the Electoral College. But Trump is also a very good example because Trump wins the election not as a third-party candidate, not as an independent, as the leader of a mainstream party, as the leader of the traditional right-wing party. In almost all cases that the far right comes to power, it is with the help of traditional elites, mostly of the right, but not always. And this is something that we saw in history too. It's a misunderstanding that the German people voted Hitler into power. Hitler never got more than 1/3 of the vote. Hitler was brought into power by the mainstream right-wing elites. It is the collaboration of forces that claim to be liberal democratic with the far right that threatens contemporary democracies. It's not all bad. although, to be honest, as a Dutch person living in the US, it is pretty bad. I think one of the reasons why today looks so bad is because we have higher expectations of what a democracy is. And so one of the things I have when I teach my students, who are all very busy, particularly with LGBTQI rights, is they will say, well, this party is against transgender rights, so they are undemocratic. Now that might be true, like depending on your definition, but if that is true, we have never had a democratic regime in world history, right? We now find, for example, gay rights or gender equality as absolutely essential to democracy, and I would argue they are. But let's face it, if we just talk about women's right to vote, our oldest democracy, right, is barely 100 years old. Right? So one of the reasons why we are, I think, so critical is because we have much higher expectations than we had. Right? Some on the left now look back at the 60s and say, oh, that was beautiful. Fantastic welfare state, everyone was included. They weren't. Even in a country like the Netherlands, Sweden, or Germany, the welfare state was largely based on a heteronormative family where the men worked, right? And where people, guest workers, were brought to lift up the white working class, right? And so while this doesn't take away the fact that that model, the welfare state itself, was a good model, or as a social democrat, the idea behind it was certainly not as inclusive as we now expect, right? And so in part, we do worse because we expect more. My argument is not that we should expect less. We should look more critical to the periods before. The second is, as I said, this is not a mass movement. This is not the silent majority, as they often present themselves. This is actually the loud minority. And this is in part because the people who shout the most are actually people who have a lot of access to power, including the media. A lot of this anti-LGBTQI agenda, anti-wokeness, which pretty much brings the far right and the right together, comes from people like me, and I see quite a lot here in the room, which are middle-aged white men with much access to the media, who write all the time for the op-ed pages of the New York Times about how woke everything becomes. Right? They're still not the voice of the majority. What we see is actually a lot of support for gender equality. There is frustration with immigration, but that is also in part because politics and the media are obsessed with immigration. We have very solid research that shows the more immigration is discussed in the media, the more important people find it. However, the same applies to climate change. It's just that we don't talk so much about climate change. So what are the solutions? The first one sounds trivial, but it is not. It is absolutely crucial that politicians, journalists, and everyone who is an activist for liberal democracy understands what liberal democracy is. Liberal democracy is a very uncomfortable compromise between democracy, majority rules, simply stated, and liberalism, minority rights. There is no golden combination of these two. Majority rule and minority rights will always, about certain issues, collide. It's not a system that can provide something that is good in the same measure for everyone all the time. Not even world peace is good for everyone. An arms dealer is not profiting from it, right? So it is a complex system. Yes, we can say populists provide simple answers, but many Democrats do the same. I remember a campaign of the Social Democrats in the Netherlands where the slogan was work, work, work. as if that would end all problems, right? And so often the argument, oh, but we can't really be, like, we can't acknowledge the complexity because populists have these simple answers and the people will follow them. If you have so little trust in the people, you should not be a Democrat. It makes no sense to build a system on a group of people you don't trust. Like, I strongly believe that people will accept complexity if you provide them with a good story. Story should have two elements. First, we should repoliticize politics. What do I mean? Let's go back to the public transport story. Like, public transport should not be in the market domain. Should be done by states. The logic of public transport should not be to make money. It should be to connect people. The same for hospitals. The same for all kinds of decisions. The key thing is that we should empower people. People should have, like, you can have elections, we can talk with each other endlessly about what we should do, but if people don't have the possibility to vote on something, then it doesn't matter. A lot of things today are outside of the democratic arena in many states. This is also related to the second thing. Even if it is in the political arena, if there is no choice between visions, it doesn't matter how you vote. For a long time in the 80s and 90s, for example, in Europe, neither immigration nor European integration were truly on the agenda, because all parties either decided not to talk about it in immigration or were positive without much vision in European integration. So if you have a different vision, you can't go anywhere. Re-idealizing politics also is crucial for the time that we're in. We're in the 21st century, which so far has been a century of crises. 9/11 and global terrorism, the Great Recession, here the alleged immigration crisis, then we had COVID, now we have Russia-Ukraine. So far, the 21st century has been a century of less rather than more. Now, if I am the state and I tell you, here's $1,000, you will say, perhaps, why do you give this to me? But if I say, I want to, you will take it. But now I'm the state and I say, I want $1,000 from you. You will certainly ask me again, why do you want it? But this time, if I say, because I want to, you will not be happy. You want the story. You want to know why do you get less or pay more. And that story should be a vision of a society. I give you this 1,000 and you build a better society. We don't have much vision anymore. Pragmatism has become the neoliberal answer. Everything is rationality. If it's efficient, it's good. Clearly, what's good at the aggregate level is not necessarily good for everyone. Or we have a story of there is no alternative, Tina politics. Think about Brexit. There were two stories. One, we take our country back, empowering. The other one, we might get World War III, not very empowering, right? So it is crucial that we have visions again. Going back to the last point, which has been mentioned here, the local level is crucial. We have societies that are getting segregated by class, by race, by education level, and increasingly by politics. It is very hard to build bridges, particularly centered around a political issue. But at the local level, people meet each other still. They meet each other in non-political settings. There, they can overcome distrust. Think about fixing up a playground in your neighborhood. You don't care whether someone is a Republican or a Democrat or Chega or something else. Right? You're just there as parents. once you work together as parents, you might come together and discuss other things. Like that type of coming together can mostly be done at the local level rather than at a national level, which is why democratic resilience should happen from the bottom up. Thank you very much.
Muito obrigada. Para o encerramento da sessão de abertura, dou então a palavra a David Pontes, diretor do Jornal Público.
Obrigado. Obrigado a todos. Não sei se me estão a ouvir. Tá? Não? Então, são bom. Não é fácil, agora sim, não é fácil depois de ouvir caso Mudde, principalmente para alguém como eu, que já o lê e já o segue há algum tempo, ter as palavras acertadas. Mas talvez um conselho que eu acho que caso Mudde tenha vantagem muito grande, e isto é obviamente um enorme elogio, de misturar conhecimento e bom senso. E nós temos andado muito falhos, quer de conhecimento, e falou-se aqui várias vezes das fake news, quer de bom senso. Eu acho que vale muito a pena, quando tivermos tempo, olhar para aquilo que ele disse aqui, olhar para algumas das definições e levá-las para aquilo que é o nosso panorama, as nossas coisas nacionais, aquelas coisas com que nos enfrentamos, às vezes sem fazer estas perguntas essenciais. E se calhar, por exemplo, sobre a discussão do Orçamento de Estado em Portugal, ficaremos com uma visão um bocadinho diferente daquilo que está implicado, das críticas que são feitas, das posições que são tomadas. Se olharmos, por exemplo, essa discussão à luz do pragmatismo liberal com que vivemos os últimos anos, versus aquele pozinho de sal e pimenta de ideologia que continuamos a precisar se não nos queremos diluir numa sociedade em que tudo é eficiência. E eu acho que se nós puxássemos atrás outra vez, e eu vou fazê-lo se calhar, e olharmos para esta comunicação à luz daquilo que é nosso, não é preciso irmos ao Trump, não é preciso irmos à Giorgia Meloni, vale a pena olhar aquilo que está a acontecer em Portugal à luz daquilo que caso Mudde nos disse, nem que seja para discordar dele, como é evidente, nem sempre temos que concordar, nem que seja para olharmos, mas certamente para pensarmos de uma maneira necessariamente diferente daquela com que nos tomamos. Eu faço parte deste ecossistema mediático em que tudo às vezes fica reduzido a uma espécie de pensamento comum em que todos nós, em nome de rentabilidade, em nome do pragmatismo, em nome da eficiência, vamos perdendo uma noção, por exemplo, desta coisa que eu, pelo menos, gosto de sublinhar. A democracia não é de facto perfeita. E nunca é suposto nos terem vendido perfeita. E quantas vezes nós, com o senhor do táxi, com a senhora do autocarro, ouvimos isto não é democracia. E a gente dá-se algum trabalho para se explicar. Não, é mesmo democracia. A discussão é mesmo a essência da democracia. O haver opiniões diferentes é a essência da democracia. E nós temos alguma tendência genérica, muitos dos que estão aqui, obviamente não, até porque são eleitos e participam ativamente, mas muito daqueles para quem vocês têm a obrigação de levar o que se passar aqui, tem este problema com o confronto. E nós, portugueses, e isto para os nossos convidados, temos quase 50 anos de fascismo, onde tudo era suposto ser calmo, onde não havia crime, não havia porque não era publicado, onde não havia pedofilia, não havia porque se escondia. E nós ainda estamos, mesmo 50 anos depois, a tentar superar muitas das limitações que 50 anos de um regime onde o silêncio era mais importante do que a voz, nós ainda estamos a tentar superar aos poucos, por muito que nos pareça já tão distante, nós ainda continuamos porque está lá bem impresso na nossa educação, na nossa maneira de ser. Dito isto, eu acho que é importante voltar às primeiras comunicações, obviamente para sublinhar o elogio da democracia feito por José Manuel Ribeiro, em resposta a este sentimento de crise, que apesar de tudo, caso Mudde nos diz que existe, acontece, mas temos a obrigação. Há uma frase dele que ele voltou a citar aqui, que eu já tinha lido muito e que normalmente no meu jornal já apliquei várias vezes, que é: não, eles não são a maioria, eles são uma minoria ruidosa. E isso, para mim, é uma lição, porque nós temos tendência a assumir aquilo que vimos em todo lado, a maneira histérica como reagimos a alguns eventos, sem perceber que, de facto, a maioria quer um outro caminho, a maioria é muito mais tolerante, a maioria tem mais capacidade de perceber o que é que quer o vizinho, o que é que percebe o vizinho, o que é que percebe o outro ser humano, do que aquilo que nos tentam vender, porque o absurdo da ameaça que eles representam é, às vezes mesmo, asfixiante e ultrapassa. A história tem-nos dado um sistema, como referiram aqui os três, um sistema que é, simultaneamente, dizia José Manuel Ribeiro, poderoso e fraco nas suas coisas. É poderoso porque é eficiente, de facto. Como dizia Emilia, é eficiente, não é só um sistema de governação, é também um sistema de valores, nunca é mais desenhar isso. E nós queremos ser seres de valores, não queremos ser só eficientes, queremos ser seres de valores, queremos defender coisas melhores. E as coisas têm estado melhores. Eu tenho a impressão que todos nós aderimos mais facilmente às más notícias e esquecemos às vezes de ver o longo caminho, que é, por exemplo, a questão de género, como foi falado aqui. Até há pouco tempo, a nossa história portuguesa é feita de 1000 anos de metade da nossa população não ter qualquer direito. Isso mudou há 50 anos de uma maneira absolutamente radical e nós temos que estar abertos e saudar isso, por muito que nos pareça, com razão, que os movimentos populistas e radicais de repente fazem-nos recuar e nos parecem estar a recuar. Eu acho que é importante nos agarrarmos ao tudo o que conseguimos até hoje, porque é sinal que vamos conseguir, porventura, fazer melhor mais à frente. É evidente que quando falamos da crise de democracia, como dizia Carola, Gunnarsson, não é só a maneira como nos governamos, como trabalhamos para que os nossos mecanismos de representação funcionem, são também direitos que vamos perdendo. São obviamente também coisas que achamos que temos por adquiridas que estão em risco. Não estão tanto como às vezes julgamos, mas estão em risco e claramente necessitam de ser cuidadas. E como disse aqui Konstantinos Koukas, há coisas fáceis de fazer, nomeadamente ao nível local. Um orçamento participativo, assembleias de cidadãos, plataformas eletrónicas de participação, workshops participativos, conselhos de jovens. Todos tínhamos a obrigação de usar nos nossos locais as nossas ferramentas. Para terminar, uma comparação que me caiu fundo, porque eu penso a mesma coisa, um bocadinho que o José Manuel Ribeiro diz ao falar de fake news, e vocês também referiram, e nomeadamente ao falar da importância que tem para a democracia local. Porque ela é direta, porque ela está próxima, porque as pessoas podem avaliar, porque as pessoas a sentem. Para mim, sempre foi uma das bases da democracia e uma das instâncias que eu acho que em Portugal está ainda longe de se cumprir da maneira como deveríamos cumprir. Nós ainda temos menos mulheres do que seria necessário nas assembleias municipais e à frente de autarquias, e só por aí um barómetro fácil de perceber o que ainda temos que caminhar. Mas eu digo que isto me é familiar porque eu penso a mesma coisa às vezes do jornalismo. Nos últimos momentos o que temos vivido é uma crise de representação, uma crise dos representantes. Há forças que atiram sobre nós desconfianças que normalmente não são obviamente justas. E o mesmo problema que têm os políticos tem o jornalismo. O jornalismo está desprezado, atirado para um canto porque as pessoas acham que não podem confiar em nós, porque aquele senhor na internet que eles veem num vídeo lhe tem mais confiança do que uma redação de um jornal que tem processos, gente paga, códigos de ética, organismos para vigiar. É mais fácil aquele rosto que a gente pensa que é amigo. E eu tenho dito aos meus jornalistas lá dentro, uma das nossas forças é a informação local. E a informação local é importante exatamente pelas mesmas razões apresentadas aqui, porque é escrutinável, porque as pessoas sentem na sua vida, porque as pessoas nos reconhecem utilidade. E por isso tenho pena que nós tenhamos, infelizmente, nós mídia todos, recuado tanto na informação local. Nós queremos recuperar caminho, mas não está fácil, mas vamos ver. Eu acho que o que sai daqui também é o apelo, obviamente, que para além daquilo que se passará nestes 3 dias, cada um de nós leve no seu bolso e distribua algum conhecimento e algum bom senso. É importante. Obrigado.
Muito obrigada. Muito obrigada. Encerramos assim a sessão de abertura do OIDP 2024.